Okay, sweet. So I'm Willow Brew. This is the podcast that we occasionally do called Brain Meats. It's not regular at all. I'm in a coffee shop in New York City, so I'm going to be on mute most of the time so that you don't hear the beautiful NPR that's going on behind me. But we're here today with Chris Peterson, who I call Petey sometimes, who I know from Center for Civic Media, and Susan Benesh, who I know from Berkman Center for Internet and Society. And so, Susan, can you talk a little bit about your counterspeech stuff?
Yes, so I have become interested in the expression of hatred online, as well as offline, but principally online, especially when that seems to encourage people not only to hate one another, but even to commit violence against one another. There are only two traditional ways of dealing with bad speech of any kind in human society, and those are punishment. That's what criminal law is for, principally. Punishment and censorship. So it's pretty clear that neither of those methods works online. We need something else. That's how I became interested in counterspeech. In other words, in ways for not authorities, but just about anybody online to speak back, speak out, speak against hateful and what I call dangerous speech in order to diminish its effect. We have not nearly enough research, but we do have some that indicates that at least in some cases counterspeech is effective. In other words, it has a positive effect on the audience at large, at all kinds of people online, and even in some cases it seems to convince the people who produced hateful speech to change at least their tune, if not also their thoughts and their actions.
Hey, thanks. And Petey, do you want to talk about your awesome user-based censorship?
Sure. So I did my graduate work here at MIT and with a thesis on what I was calling user-generated censorship. And the basic phenomenon slash practice slash thing that I was studying was how people manipulate social media to suppress speech, right? So we sort of have this common way or framing or understanding of social media sites as things that serve as the collection basis for the wisdom of crowds. If you follow the kind of James Surowiecki tradition, the synthesis of public opinion through a networked public sphere, if you follow the Benklerian tradition. And what I was looking at were cases where people have taken the sorts of tools and mechanisms that are meant to help compose these kinds of spheres or organize these kinds of intelligences and then subvert them in ways the designers did not intend. So my main case study was a group called the Dig Patriots, a group of self-identified, very conservative users of the social news site Dig, who operated a Yahoo group or congregated within and through a Yahoo group to try to make Dig more conservative than it would have been without their intervention. So this included things like swarming liberal posts and downvoting them very soon after they were posted so that they would never make it to the front page of Dig, doing coordinated flagging as spam or abusive or against terms of service campaigns against liberal Dig users, recruiting very active users as Dig as delegates who would reliably upvote them, kind of no matter what those users' political perspectives were, while simultaneously turning against those users with those mutual friends and delegates through other members of their extended network if those mutuals started posting liberal content. Taking the discussion sections of Dig and using that as not so much as a space within which discourse occurred as much as an instrument through which it could be suppressed or elevated. So one really fascinating thing is that Dig, in their algorithm, factored comment activity as kind of an index of interest. So ceteris paribus, the more things that were commented on, or the more a post was commented on, the higher it would rise on Dig's front page. So the Dig Patriots would try to troll conservative submissions, so that liberals would come in and debate them, and then the conservative post would get up higher. And then on liberal posts, which they disagreed, they had kind of like an iron rule against commenting on liberal posts, and they would just like snark in the back channel on the Yahoo group, so that they would suppress through inaction and through very thoughtful and conscientious lack of commenting that post from going any higher. That was my main case study because an enemy of the Patriots leaked their message board archive and published it, so I had a lot of material to work through. But you'll see very similar things occurring across all different sorts of social media. So Gillian York at the EFF has tracked a lot of what she calls content policing through these various mechanisms on Facebook. Tarleton Gillespie and Kate Crawford have a new paper out, What is a Flag For? And it's kind of all about the ambiguity in these different sorts of socio-technical instruments on social media. You saw similar cases on Twitter with people writing, hijacking hashtags or writing bots. There's a big tradition on Reddit of playing around with downvote bots that allow people to enroll different user accounts, then follow users around and downvote them or upvote them based on certain political beliefs or whatever. Tumblr, these campaigns of marking people as being harassing in order to try to get them ghosted so that their reblogs won't appear on anybody else's Tumblrs. A lot of different things in this space that are all about subverting widely held beliefs and subverting the intentions of the designers of social media systems to serve as these collective basins of speech and the synthesis of some kind of public sphere.
Awesome, thank you. So now I'm going to ask how you two tend to see what the other person said within the light of your own focus. And so, for instance, Susan, when you talk about Facebook and how there are only mechanisms for liking something and not methods for disliking things, there are only methods for flagging stuff. Do you see in PD's focus how that might play out, or like what we can learn and make different mistakes than what Facebook is making right now?
I do. It's interesting when PD says that effectively groups of people online are subverting a platform's architecture by suppressing conversation of a particular type. Then first of all, I think, I don't want to guess at PD's views, but I get the idea that he doesn't think that's good. Obviously, neither do I. I also have to point out that in some cases, a platform's architecture itself suppresses freedom of speech and also suppresses dissent where dissent would be healthy, suppresses dissent against hatred and inflammatory views. So, as you said, Willow, Facebook is an example. On Facebook, there are really only three ways. I should say Facebook is an example, particularly in certain contexts. So there are only three ways of reacting to a post on Facebook. You can like it. You absolutely can't dislike it, right? You can like it, you can comment on it, and you can flag it or report it to Facebook. If you comment on it, the person whose page that is can very easily suppress your comment if that person doesn't like it. The quote-unquote owner of the page can suppress your comment either by deleting it or by festooning that post with lots of other supportive comments. After all, you can comment on your own post, or you can get your friends to comment on your own post. Something like in the way that Petey was describing people doing on Reddit. And then finally, you can flag to Facebook. You don't know how Facebook will respond, and very importantly, if you flag, only Facebook will see that. No one else online will see that you have effectively expressed that you don't like that post. Of course, one big difference between what Petey is describing and what I'm describing is I'm thinking about users whose attempts to respond to content online are constructive. And he's describing gangs of people who are trying, on the contrary, to suppress certain views. So the way that Facebook's architecture shuts down positive dissent can be illustrated with the case of Myanmar, where unfortunately there are many political figures and also religious figures who are expressing hatred of Muslims and even dehumanizing Muslims in ways that are unfortunately dominating the conversation in certain circles on Facebook, and in some cases seem to be directly inflammatory. For example, there was a classic inflammatory rumor that spread just a few weeks ago that a Buddhist girl had been raped by Muslim men in Mandalay. That was followed by real clashes in which several people were killed. So now, of course, it's difficult to trace exactly where a rumor started, but there's no question that that rumor circulated on Facebook, like other vicious, brutal content on Facebook, that people who don't like it don't really have any means of demonstrating on Facebook. So, well, let me give Petey a chance to respond. This conversation stimulates lots of ideas.
Well, no, I think those are really great points, and I would have sort of two responses. So one is, you're right in terms of inferring my views, which is that I came to the sort of stuff that I was studying thinking, this is very clearly a problem. It's like a bad thing that people do this, and it's a bad thing for these gangs, and that's why I called what I was studying user-generated censorship, because of the negative valence that comes with censorship. I will say that I found that conception was really complicated for me when I started diving into the work, and I'll give you an example. When I read through the 13,000 messages in the Dig Patriots archive, it's really easy to read them unsympathetically. So there's a lot of racist, homophobic vitriol in there. It's all the worst stuff that you could possibly imagine in terms of discriminatory bile, and then you're like, well, these people are just shoving this content down. But they're also doing it for an interesting reason, right? Which is that they said, well, look, if we don't coordinate, then the liberal point of view, what we identify as a liberal or progressive point of view, is going to win on Dig because there are more liberal users on Dig. And it's simultaneously possible, if you ignore or look away from the vitriol or separate it, the tone from the intervention, to say, well, what the Dig Patriots were doing was really the equivalent of a political minority organizing a Get Out the Vote campaign, where they were like, well, we have to coordinate, we have to make sure that all of our members of our viewpoint get out and do that. And I think that most people in a liberal polity, liberal small L, like classic political liberalism here, would view that in a positive light, right? Like, that's something that we like in a voting public, is that kind of coordination and synthesis of the view. And their critique of the Dig-based model and of the social media kind of voting model was that it's just crudely majoritarian, right? And that is a much more sympathetic reading of the kinds of interventions that I'm thinking about. And I have to confess, it became a lot more complex and difficult for me to do my sort of research in a normative, to think about the normative light in which I was trying to cast my research subjects. Because I mean, actually, a lot of the liberal users of Diggs were gaming in exactly the same way. It was just sort of accepted that by their community that was fine when they did it, but not fine when when the conservative Dig patriots were doing it. In terms of the counterspeech stuff that you're talking about, it's actually interesting. I'm also a fellow at the National Center for Technology and Dispute Resolution, and we just had our annual conference out in the Bay Area where I talked about dispute reconciliation on social media. And Facebook has historically had a lot of problems of the type Susan has described, but it's also introducing some very interesting interventions in this space through their compassion research group, which what they call it. So now it's, if I remember correctly, so Facebook started actually talking to its users about why people reported photos, for example. And what they found was that in like 67% of cases, people reported photos not because they were against their terms of service, but because they found them embarrassing. And so Facebook has now, in some cases, introduced a feature for users where the users can sort of say, we can indicate, I think this photo was embarrassing. And it doesn't go to their human review team. It just sends a message to the other user. Okay. It just sends a message to the other user saying that, hey, this is embarrassing. Would you consider taking it off Facebook? And they've implemented a lot of lateral user-to-user interventions in this case.
Yeah, Petey, they call it social reporting, and they encourage users to send, in fact, their own message to the other.
Exactly.
The idea is to, as one of my friends said, oh, you mean Facebook is teaching people to communicate with one another? And in a way, that's exactly right. It now the interface that many people get on Facebook when they want to flag content, particularly, but not only an image, prompts them to express why they don't like that image, and then ask them if they would like to first engage with the person who posted it. And then it prompts them to use emotional language to explain their concern to the other user, to the person who posted it. It's essentially teaching them how to communicate in a way that is more likely to resolve the dispute without engaging Facebook directly. So Facebook and the researchers with whom it's working to develop this method has reported extremely good success with it. The thing is, and it's quite an achievement, there's no question. The thing is, though, that it's useful when a friend of mine posts a photograph that I think makes me look ugly, you know, or that shows me, I don't know, drinking, exactly as you said, something that's embarrassing. It's not very useful, though, when a political leader in Myanmar posts a horrifying, bloody, photoshopped image that is not only likely to increase hatred among some people on Facebook, but is also terrifying to others. So then if the Facebook reporting flow prompts somebody in Myanmar, hey, would you like to engage with the person who posted that photograph? And the answer is no, actually, because I'm afraid that that person will kill me. Then this is also an example of very different social and political environments in which people are using social media, which is, I think, one important point when we think about all of this stuff. Another point that occurs to me in response to what you were saying is that maybe a good test for those of us thinking about this stuff and doing research on it is to say, if the views of the people constituting a gang and trying to change the conversation on a particular platform, if those views were ones I agreed with, would I see it the same way as I do when I disagree with the views, you know? as you said, if conservatives are trying in a sense to adjust or game the conversation on Reddit, would I see it the same way if people I agree with were doing that?
Absolutely.
I think the question is useful. Part of why I'm concerned about the effects of the architecture of Facebook in Myanmar is that much of the content on Facebook in Myanmar at the moment is quite alarming.
I'm going to pause this for just a second. Petey needs to relocate, so I'm going to call him in via Uber conference. Just a sec.
Hey, Willow, can I duck out for about a minute and check on something and be right back? Back.
Boom.
I don't know if that last ramble made any sense, and you're more than welcome to delete it.
No, it totally made sense. And welcome back, Petey.
Thank you.
So let's see. I took notes. So it sounds to me like these are we're starting to figure out how I think appropriate use of technology and teaching people how to interact more directly with each other. I think my personal views are that the internet allows us to communicate in high resolution, in high fidelity. Like we can actually talk to a lot of people with the message that we intended to. And that then it just gets down to a matter of if I agree with what the other person is saying or not, and if we have the structure for a civil discourse in that. And to me, and I'd love, to me, Petey's research is about how people are gaming a system with views that I agree with or not in order to be active. But it's about using the system to be active versus what I see a lot of the counter-speech stuff as is people using the technology to be able to speak to each other more directly.
Yeah, and if I could say, I mean, one thing that I think maybe just from hearing Susan talk about her work that I would say to tie all this together is that, so I haven't been posting much about the current conflict in Israel and in Gaza on Facebook because I have Israeli friends and I have Palestinian friends. And I found that in the past, when I do that, it ends up more often than not just becoming a place where people are yelling at each other because that is one of the ways that they can sort of like express themselves and get so much anger and fear and passion and pain out of their bodies at an other, right, at an enemy, through social media. And that it is Facebook comments, no more than other comment sites on the internet, do not easily lend themselves to becoming the sort of space where, mutually respectful discourse allows differing intersubjectivities to be rendered together commensurately, right? So like there's always this distinction in speech between instrumental speech that's like we're drawing lines on what tribe we are and who we want to be, and the sort of communication that is meant to like help knit together different worldviews and perspectives. And what I think my research was really showing was that more often than not, at least in my view, the sorts of platforms that we thought were helping us knit together worldviews are in fact just ways in which we are weaponizing those worldviews and using them to create, escalate, delineate conflict. And it sounds like Susan is talking about that as like also like maybe that's what you see happening too, and you're trying to figure out ways to allow for those sorts of conflicts to be transformed into more constructive discussions that help people understand each other's viewpoint.
Yes, I have to say I can't help reading a tremendous amount of stuff about Israel and Palestine at the moment.
Right.
And I've been, on the one hand, newly sickened and appalled by so much of what's being posted, and also by the fact that in so many spaces online there is not dialogue, there is not an encounter of people who have extreme views with anybody else who, in other words, people are not hearing one another across lines. On the other hand, as soon as I feel despair that, exactly as you said, PD, the online space is just a place for people to vent and in a way to discharge, to almost like firearms to shoot whole content. Then I have seen discussions online among people who I don't think would as easily have encountered one another offline. Before there were such spaces. The conversations in a few spaces online are painful and difficult and civil and quite diverse. And so I think, before we could converse online, would we have had that at all? Hard to say. I also wanted to raise another point, which is the difference between private spaces and public spaces for discourse. We make the distinction certainly in the First Amendment jurisprudence and in general when we talk about free speech in law, between public space and private space. And of course, online the distinction isn't very clear. It's maybe useful to think about it in terms of Facebook. Facebook started as a set of private spaces, and for the first few years of its life was principally used by people to have private conversations with one another. People who already knew each other offline were discussing the kinds of things you discuss in private, very personal sorts of things, photographs of your kids, all of that. In certain contexts and in certain countries and regarding certain political issues like Israel and Palestine, Facebook has become a much more public space. And there, the fact that there isn't a good means of expressing dissent or of making dissent visible to lots of other users, lots of other people on Facebook, all of a sudden that becomes important in a way in which it absolutely isn't when you're having private, small conversations with people you already know. So it's worth thinking about platform architecture and the way in which groups of people speak online also in that context. Is it private speech among people who know one another, or is it public speech among people who don't?
Well, and so one thing I will say about that is that I agree as a design problem that one of the ways, one of the best ways that I've ever had sort of feedback given in my worldview changed, and Willow and I have talked something about this, is when I do something that pisses off another person, and they take me aside privately and say, hey, you really bothered me, or you really, screwed up for these reasons. And in private, and here I don't mean the public-private legal distinction as much as like allowing me to save face and not kind of bringing a lot of people in, and basically saying, you screwed up and you hurt my feelings for these reasons. And I find that it's much easier for me to incorporate that kind of feedback and to grow and to change than in an environment where I feel threatened in a small p non-legal public setting, right? And while for me, the public-private distinction of Facebook or of any social media in the legal sense is just so complicated that I usually try to avoid it.
Yep.
The distinction between public-private in like how many other people is this discussion being performed for? What is the extent of that audience? And how much is my reputation and person on trial? Is, I think, a really critical aspect of this. Now, and that's one place where, where Facebook has, for stuff where you already know a person, you're like, well, this photo was embarrassing of me, and they've really created a back channel in an incredibly useful way. And I agree with your assessment entirely that back channels for embarrassing photos seem to be working better than back channels for like violent existential political crises. And maybe they always will. But that type of, but thinking really intentionally and strategically about back channels as constructive places to engage in political conflict is the sort of design space that I'd really like to see some companies doing this kind of research and development in.
This is one of the things that I really, really liked about Google Reader, and now the old Reader, is that it wasn't one-on-one, because sometimes you're not safe with someone, either because they might inflict political harm on you, or because you have a history with that person that they do inflict harm upon you. And so the social pressure is important, and having solidarity, and it's not about saving face at that point. But to me, saving face is about creating safety for the person to come to terms with what they've done and change and then be a better person. But that's assuming good faith, and I think you're getting at that.
Yeah.
And so I think that, and one of the things that I've gotten most out of Susan's research is that counter-speech is possible because sometimes the audience that you're speaking to is not the audience that you intended to speak to. And that brings in new social pressure. And so my final question, well, one, do you guys want to respond to that? And then I'll have a final question.
No, I would say for me, that's really important. And the good faith argument in particular is one that I think is really hard. One of the ways that I started talking about my research was that these are people who are operating in bad faith. And then I realized that the Dig Patriots weren't operating in bad faith vis-a-vis themselves. They were operating in bad faith vis-a-vis like the designers of the system. And so like what counts as good faith and what counts as bad faith is, as Willow just pointed out, audience dependent. And really, really, really hard, if not impossible, to set out equitably and categorically as like a design presumption and premise for any sort of site, right? It's something you kind of have to work out as you go. And maybe I'm more pessimistic than Willow and then Susan in this respect, with the slight shade of optimism that, like, I guess we might as well keep trying because it's better than not.
Well, I'm not always accused of being optimistic, but if you spend your time reading the kind of truly stomach-turning stuff, that I know we all see stomach-turning stuff online, but since I'm really focused on genocide prevention, wow. So I completely agree with you. You know, you've got to try. You've got to do something.
Right.
But the other little reason for optimism that I haven't mentioned yet, and so I'd like to, is that a few sort of pieces of research that we have on who's producing nasty, toxic, hateful content online suggests that many of the people who are doing that are not usually behaving that way. To take maybe an unexpected source of such research, you know, Riot Games produces League of Legends, and an enormous number of people play League of Legends, and as in most gaming environments, the tone of discourse is not always terribly elegant. So gamers are used to pretty nasty ways of
Trash talk.
Yeah, exactly. But according to Jeffrey Lynn, who directed a very interesting research project for Riot Games a couple of years ago, they started it because the discourse norms became even worse, quite a lot worse on Riot Games. People were saying especially hostile, aggressive things much more often. So Riot Games began studying, first of all, who was doing that, and concluded that 50% of the people who were using really just terrible, they call it toxic language, were not people who normally behave that way, at least on that platform. Some other research suggests the same kind of thing, that many of the people, for example, some counter-speech research I've done on Twitter showed that in response to counter-speech, some people recant or apologize. So if you imagine that most of the people, as one might, that most of the people who are saying really awful, hostile, vicious things online are awful, hostile, vicious people habitually, then you'd think there's not really any point in engaging with them, counter-speaking to them to try to bring them around. However, if as many as half of them are not habitually awful, hostile, and vicious, then maybe they can be convinced. And I've begun collecting examples of hateful and hostile tweets followed by lots of counter-speech, and then seeing that some of the original accounts then recant or apologize. This is only very nascent anecdotal research for the moment, but I'm just engaging on a 2-year project to try to do that at scale, and so maybe we can talk again later on. But in other words, there has been very little work to find out to what extent it is possible to engage across those lines and make some difference. So without being too Pollyannish, it seems to me it's worth at least investigating that.
Yeah.
Well, so my last question for you is, we know that there aren't going to be any silver bullets, because there never are, because then, you know, it changes from a werewolf into a vampire, and so your silver bullets don't mean anything anyway. But what components have you seen that have been successful in healthy, transparent, like visible dissent? And it doesn't necessarily have to be online. Just like, what do you think some of those key components are? That, because there are software developers out there, and there are people who do this work who care and want to know how to do this better and the new things that they're building. And so what should they learn from or think about that is pragmatic as well?
For me, the most, and I mean, I already mentioned this, but I think the research that I found the most interesting pragmatically has been the compassion research at Facebook, which is so freighted right now given Facebook experiment. And I don't, you know, certainly we could spend an entire another hour talking about Facebook and human subjects research and like compassion research as a thing and the amelioration of dispute and like Fabian socialism. But overall, I do think that the sort of work that they're doing, which is like, okay, instead of imposing designers top-down categories on like what kinds of disputes can occur and why would they occur, doing user-based research and design about like what are the disputes that you actually interact with, and how can we help users solve those between each other, mediated and assisted by the technology, as opposed to like the source up to a human review team, implement decision downward on other user. That is the sort of stuff that I find really promising.
Thank you. And Susan?
Two ideas. One, I do think that it is, people pay attention to what other people think. So if users can see that other people like them are also worried about, objecting to, concerned by toxic or inflammatory speech, that's likely to have a salutary effect. And so developers should think about ways of making dissenting views apparent without allowing people to game a system successfully. That's the catch-22, right? We're trying to make sure that it isn't possible for people of bad faith to make their voices, their nasty voices, louder than those of others. And so that includes opportunities for dissent. That's one. And the second suggestion I would make is to study in a granular way different forms of counterspeech. There are some obvious lessons that we've already got, although maybe we don't yet have full empirical evidence to back it up, but all the anecdotal cases that I've looked at suggest that if in your counterspeech you use obscenities and hostile language, in other words, if your counterspeech sounds a lot like the original speech, it is unlikely to be successful at convincing the original speaker to change. So, as I say, that's a no-brainer. There must be many other more subtle techniques that one can learn from studying counterspeech that is already taking place in the wild, that is already out there in the data.
Awesome. So do either of you have closing thoughts, and we'll wrap it up?
Thanks for facilitating the meeting of our brains.
Thanks for meeting.
Did we actually also talk offline over coffee one time?
Yes, I come back tonight. When are you next involved? Well, we'll figure this out when we're not on the air. Okay, I'm going to hang this up now.